Well, today is Sunday, May the 28th. We're getting ready to have another holiday tomorrow, Memorial Day. There's several Memorial Day services around in the area, depending on, what you want to participate in. So, be aware of, you know, of the festivities, and hopefully the weather will hold out and we'll be able to have a good holiday.
Gary, tell them about the ceremony tomorrow at the depot.
Yeah, American Legion Post 330 is having their annual memorial service at 9:30 in the morning at the depot up here. And that way everybody can make it, be nice. It's
It's
really
always
good listening.
very good fun.
Yeah, and we honor those that have fallen, and the crosses are on the hill over there by the city hall. Some people ask me why we don't put them down the street.
I was gonna ask you that.
Well, number one, the city has to do with that, not us really. I mean, we support it and help. But on Memorial Day, you're supposed to recognize those that have fallen in combat. And on Veterans Day, you recognize all veterans, living and past, and that's why those are put down the street on Veterans Day. But on Memorial Day, we just want to honor those that made the ultimate sacrifice. So and that's those up on the hill, 2083 or 8 of them, I think. So.
Okay. I know in saw a sign in Fayetteville. There's going to be a memorial service over in Fayetteville as well tomorrow at 12 noon, I think. So just be aware of what's going on in your area and support those that have given, as Gary said, the ultimate sacrifice. Okay, the new books are in the back. If you did not get one, for the new quarter that starts next week, we'll be studying the book of Jeremiah. Great Old Testament book. I enjoy studying Jeremiah and so forth. And I've got, at the end of the class, I'll give you the Jeremiah optional home study handout. At the end, there's 5 interesting questions from chapter 1 of the book of Jeremiah. So I'll do that at the end and so forth. We are studying, we're going to finish up the book of Job today. Since I was not able to be here last week, I'm going to spend a few minutes and do a review, sort of get us up to speed, and then we'll jump in chapter 40, verse 1 in just a minute. But as we know, Job was a very righteous man, lived near the time frame of Abraham, based on the way he operated and conducted himself. It appears that he lived sometime around the time of Abraham. He lived south and east of where Abraham ultimately ended up. We don't know exactly because we don't have a map from that time frame. It's a guess. An archaeologist have not found any evidence of Job. They have found evidence of Abraham, but not Job. And we just, there's things we don't know. But Ezekiel talked about Job, and James, the half brother of Jesus, talked about Job. So we know he was a real person that lived. First of all, God allowed Satan to take Job's livestock and children, and Job refused to blame God and remained righteous. And then God allowed Satan to give Job a disease. It was characterized, first of all, by boils. There was itching. We talked about the wood scraping because the boils were itching and he would scrape it with a piece of wood. He had a drastic change of appearance. He had running sores, corroding bones, gnawing pain, blackened skin, and a fever. Now, if you've ever had a fever, it makes you feel bad. If you get on up there around 100, 101, you don't feel very well. So Job's got all of these things, and yet he's going right along. He refuses to blame God for what has happened to him. He doesn't understand it, but he's dealing with it. He's persevering, and he doesn't lose faith. Now, one of the things that I find interesting is we listed all of the ailments that he has, and yet he doesn't blame God. But over in Job chapter 19, beginning in verse 25, and to me this is the heart of Job. It says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at the last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another, how my heart yearns within me." How many of us could make that claim if we had boils, fever, corroding bones, a fever, blackened skin? How many of us could say that? To me, that was the heart.
What verse in
It was Job chapter 19, verses 25 and 26. So with all these elements, and as David brought out at the beginning, this went on for about a year. I mean, this was not just a couple of months. This whole process drug out on and on and on and on for 12 months. So that's when James talks about the perseverance of Job, you can reflect on having to put up with boils and itching and fever, corroding bones for a year. That's perseverance. And yet, through all of that, he knows his Redeemer lives. Quite a interesting change from what we think about today when we talk about Job. Now, we talked about some of the interesting parts of Job, and one of the things was, did Job see dinosaurs? And today, beginning in chapter 40, we're going to look at the behemoth, chapter 40, verse 15 through 24. And then in chapter 41, the entire chapter 41 is dedicated to this creature and how fierce this creature is. Now, a lot of people speculate it was a giant alligator. Just like the behemoth is a giant hippopotamus. All I ask is you get a picture of a hippopotamus and then you read chapter 40 beginning in verse 15 and let you decide whether it's a hippopotamus or not. Because I don't think it is. And I think it goes back to what?
Description of the tail.
Right, the description of the tail, if you look at the little scrawny tail on a hippopotamus, don't look nothing like that. But I'm not saying what it is, I'm just saying I don't think it's a hippopotamus. And the levitation or Levithan that's in chapter 41, verses 1 through 34, I don't believe it's an alligator.
Well, when I studied on that, it said it was a hippopotamus, but they said they didn't know either.
A lot of people keep, they're on both sides. I got some that say it's a brontosaurus, the leftovers that didn't get killed in the flood. To me, a brontosaurus makes more sense than a hippopotamus because, as Gary said, the description of the tail, beginning in verse 15 of chapter 40, if you read through those 10 verses, I can't, and I'm sitting there and I got a picture of the hippopotamus over here. It ain't no hippopotamus. I mean, it's close, but no.
Well, Brontosaurus was supposed to be the largest of all the dinosaurs anyway.
Right,
Huge.
right. And then this Levithan, some people think it was a dragon. Now, that brings up another can of worms. And when you get into paleontology, you get into classification of dinosaurs and so forth. And we know this is a Tyrannosaurus Rex. We know this is a Brontosaurus. We know this is a Stegosaurus. But then there's the unknown. And there's several unknowns, of which one of them, some scientists believe, was a dragon. Now, some people say, well, dragons were a myth. Well, there's some that say that's not true. So, and there's a lot of history written about dragons. And so you have to compare, why did these people write about these mythical creatures like this? And some people, well, they weren't mythical. Well, some say, yes, they are. And that's another whole battle. But if you read chapter 41 and you believe that it's an alligator, that's fine. But again, the description doesn't fit an alligator. But everybody's got their opinion, and everybody in here is a paleontologist, and I'll let y'all decide on your own. But I'm just letting you know that everybody doesn't agree on what the creatures are in chapter 40 and 41. Some of the brains of the world are not conclusive. So I'll let each one of you do your own paleontology research, and you can decide. But there are not any conclusions as to what these creatures are.
Were they both grass eaters? Hippopotamus and the dinosaur. Some of the dinosaurs.
Yes, a hippopotamus and a brontosaurus were vegetation eaters. Yes, that is one thing they have in common.
And the other thing on the dragon part is, well, I ruled that part out, is mythically dragons, spit fire and all that out. And I believe if that was the case, that would have been mentioned. That this thing was fire breathing or whatever. And it never says anything about that. So, and from what I can see with the teeth and stuff that supposed dragons have, I wouldn't think they would be grass eaters.
Well, now the Leviathan was not a grass eater. Only the behemoth was grass eaters. The Leviathan was a meat eater.
Well, that's what I said. I think the dragon was too. If people think a dragon is the animal they're talking about.
So anyway, like I said, you can read the scripture for yourself, and you can use Google and get some information, and you can weigh the pros and cons of what you see. But anyway, kind of interesting how things come about. Now, in chapter 38 and 39, Job finally gets an audience with God. And God speaks God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. And people say, well, why did God speak out of a whirlwind? As we know from the book of Exodus, no one can look on God because they would die. So God is using the whirlwind as a median to speak to Job. Okay, and people say, well, he's speaking audibly, and most scholars say yes. Job heard God speaking, and Job knew it was God. So anyway, and so the first thing is God rebukes Job, and then he says that he wants Job to answer some questions. He's going to test Job by, asking him some questions. And this is where we begin the 77 questions that God is going to ask Job. Now, we're not going to go through all 77. But some of the questions are related to the earth. Some of the questions are related to the oceans. Some are related to the morning. Where does the morning come from? He talks about how deep is the ocean? Where does light come from? Who changes the weather? Where are the stars? Who made the constellations? Now, one thing we need to realize, we figure this was about 2000 BC, which would be about 4,000 years from today, approximately. Constellations were known in Job's time. That's not something that we discovered, our generation. Job knew about constellations 4,000 years ago and talks about it. So, all these people that say, well, this is a sign of this and this and this. No. God did this at the beginning of time, and it has always been there. And Job understood this, and he knew what a constellation was. And he talks about it in his book. So, and then he asks questions about floods. When you have a heavy rain and all this flood comes, where does the water go? And then he talks about who feeds the lions and the ravens. How do mountain goats and deer reproduce? Who gives the wild ox his strength? Why is the ostrich stupid? You know, the ostrich will bury his head in the ground in a hole. And, you know, God, you know, he's asking, Job, tell me about this. What do you know about the flight of the hawk? Have you ever seen a hawk flying? I mean, they're very majestic, great wingspans. Then he talks about the nest of an eagle. If you know much about eagles, they nest on very high up on rock cliffs. If you've ever seen the nest of a bald eagle, they're usually way up high and on a rock and so forth. If you've ever watched the National Geographic special on bald eagles, if you ever get a chance to watch that, it's absolutely amazing how those birds even make a nest, you know, gather all the sticks and straws and stuff and make those nests in those rocks. How do they find that?
That's like 8 feet across too. It's
Yeah.
huge.
Now they're huge, and you know, and you think all these animals were there 4,000 years ago, and God's asking about deer and ox and hawks and eagles. You know, people want to think that everything evolved, you know, over time from molecules and amoebas and all those other one-celled animals. No, God created it in the beginning. But he's asking all of these questions, and Job, you know, is sitting here, and as God goes through these 77 questions, you know, God's trying to get Job's attention as to how vast earth is. And he wants to know, you know, if you're going to do these things and complain, then why don't you tell me about this? And Job very quickly, after he gets through the 77 questions, realizes, I don't have an answer. He doesn't have an answer. He doesn't know about how, you know, all these animals, the reproduction of mountain goats and deer. He doesn't know about that. He knows they exist, but, you know, who's that? And what about the weather? Does Job know anything about the weather? He knows it. Some days it rains, some days it's sunshine. So God is really trying to help Job understand how vast the earth is. And I think as we read through these and we look at the 77 questions, we have, you know, some knowledge. We understand a little bit about the weather, and we understand that meteorologists study the weather, and they can sometimes forecast the weather. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. But just as a side note, God never gets it wrong. We always have the right weather at the right time for our location. And it's hard to believe, with all the vastness of the earth, that God controls the weather at every location in the world at the same time.
It's interesting that I saw a public broadcasting show of observation of God's works from the 1,000 satellites that are up there, and now they're beginning to understand how not just the weather on this side of the earth, but God's in control and from the other side of the earth, and how they interface with the tides. Was one thing, example, a desert, an old lake bed dried up years ago. Now that lake bed makes dust. You can see it from the satellite. We wondered why the Amazon and the lush greenery were so lush and so rich. The dust from that desert, you can see it move 2,000 miles, and it settles in the Amazon jungle, and that's why everything is so alive and rich. God planned it that way. Speaking of hippopotamus, and that looks sort of like that could refer to some of this we were just talking about. They seem there was so up where this other side goes and the tide goes up and down. They're sort of responsible for the rise and fall, because they cut bulldoze like through the swamp and through those ferns and go through that jungle to a source on the other side, that and those paths that the water come through to affect the tide that affects the hurricanes and all and the weather, and all of that's God's plan. It's just amazing. I'm amazed now that the scientists used to think this is where it is. We'll tell y'all, but all they had to do is look in the book of Job.
Right. And thank you for sharing that, because there's so much that goes on. And who would have thought about hippopotamuses having an effect on the tide, and the dust from one location travels 2,000 miles to another location to fertilize the ground. I'm sure, every week scientists learn more and more and more about the earth and how intricate it is and how everything is controlled, not only here, but in Australia, India. It's amazing.
I like it that the scientists that thought they knew everything are being told gotten straight by the Bible and the things that are really true. They're coming back to realizing, and I hope they come all the way back.
That is true. I think God will show, more and more that there was intelligent design that made it, and intelligent design keeps it running. And this thing about climate, God controls the climate. It's not emissions and all of this other stuff. God controls the climate. And if they think they've got global warming now, wait until God sets the earth on fire, then you'll have global warming. And I'll leave that to that. Now, we're over in Job chapter 40, verse 1. We're winding down on the questions. God is going to ask Job one more. It says, "Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him?" Now, Job is sort of having a little bit of problem here with God and all this that has gone on. And I have to give Job some understanding here if I had boils and fever and all the other elements that we listed had been going on for about a year, I'd have some questions. And Job is not being, I don't think Job is actually sinning or anything. He's just, it's hard to understand. I'm going through this, I'm going through this, I'm going through this. And, you know, he's trying to wrestle with this problem. And so God says, you know, you're contending with me. He who rebukes God, let him answer it. And then all of a sudden, Job has gone through the 77 questions. And then Job in verse 3, then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. Job finally realizes he doesn't know. He doesn't know. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Will you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? Or can you thunder with a voice like his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor, and array yourself with glory and beauty. God says, you know, if you think you've got the answers, then do these things. And Job is very quickly, you know, as the old saying, he's getting a little lower in the seat. He's kind of cowering down. Verse 14, he says, then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. Now look at the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. Once again, I don't think that's the description of a hippopotamus, but I'm not going to.
Their power's in their mouth.
Right.
Yeah.
So, anyway, God is questioning Job about these animals. And then in chapter 41, verse 1, he says, can you draw out a Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? He's talking about, kind of, as best we can tell, he's talking about with a fish hook kind of thing. Of course, they didn't have the kind of fishing equipment that James has today with all these sophisticated poles and lines and hooks and all that. But, you know, he's talking about, you know, could you catch, you know, let's pretend he's an alligator, and you all probably been to Florida and been to the alligator farm, seen alligators. You know, would you want to try to catch an alligator with a fish hook? I don't think I would. I don't think I have a line that could hold an alligator. Do you, James?
Yeah, they make them.
They do?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't have one.
He doesn't have one.
I'm not into that, but they do make them.
Oh,
They
okay.
use them a lot out in Louisiana.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, you know, they're talking about doing things that, remember this is 4,000 years ago. And I don't know what kind of fishing equipment they had back then, but I don't think they had anything that could hold, you know, a large alligator. It's just unbelievable, you know, and God's, you know, trying to get Job to understand what's going on. And then in chapter 42, verse 1, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything. Okay, Job has now endured the 77 questions, and he doesn't have an answer. And he says, I know you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You ask, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered that I did not understand. Folks, there's a lot of things I don't understand. Even in May of 2023, there's a lot of things I just don't understand. But Job realized he didn't understand any things either. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Job beginning to realize there's a lot of things he didn't know. Listen, please, let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now, during this particular time, as we've seen from Abraham, covering yourself in dust and ashes was a way of humility. You know, they realized, you know, I'm so vile, I'm so bad, and I just cover myself. So a lot of times it's sackcloth and ashes. And they did this as a humility. And so we find out that Job is now understands God's position, understands Job doesn't understand things, but God is wonderful and is in control. Then in the rest of 42, God rebukes the three friends of Job for their
They bent his ear the wrong way.
yes, and they've said things that weren't true. And and in verse 9 of 42, so Ephaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shumanite and Zophar the Nephanite went and did as the Lord commanded them, for the Lord had accepted Job. And the Lord restored Job's losses. Notice this, and when he had prayed for his friends, and then he prayed for his friends. Folks, Job went and prayed for those three friends. Even all of this time and all of this bad advice, Job prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then all his brothers, all his sisters, and all those who had been his acquaintances before came to him and ate food with him in his house. And they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. And each one gave him a piece of silver and each a ring of gold. Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. And if you'll go back to chapter 1, you can see how God had blessed Job. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first Jenemiah, the name of the second Hezekiah, and the name of the third Karina Hepik. In all the land were found no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. Now that's significant because during this time only the males got inheritance. But Job gave his 3 daughters an inheritance as well. And after this, Job lived 140 years. Now this is after all of this, he lived an additional 140 years. We don't know how old he was when he got afflicted, but now he's going to live another 140 years. That'd be all right with me if I lived another 140 years. And saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died old and full of days. So, 4 generations of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren.
That's at least 80 years.
Yeah. So you can see, after all of this, his health is restored, his family is restored, he prays for his friends, they are restored, and we have a beautiful ending to what appeared to be a very tragic story. Now, I want to go to close out in the book of Habakkuk. Chapter 3. Let's see, Habakkuk chapter 3. Beginning in verse 17. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, through the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high heels. Folks, even though we don't have any food, and even though things look bleak, I'm going to rejoice in the Lord, because that is where my salvation comes from. So I think once again we see Job had a heart for God, and he expressed it in knowing that his Redeemer lived and that one day he would see him. And I think that's how he persevered through all of that. Satan was defeated. God got the glory. And in turn, Job lived a full life, an additional 140 years, and he saw 4 generations of his children, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, great-great-great-great, grandchildren, all of that. I mean, he had a wonderful heritage and wonderful ancestry. And it's all because of his faithfulness. And that's the reason he's mentioned in the book of James for his perseverance. He persevered, and God blessed him with an abundance greater than what he had before. And yes, I'm sure that there were a lot of questions about why this happened in the beginning, but I think he realized after the 77 questions from God that God knew what he was doing, and he just had to accept it. Does anyone have a question or comment? I apologize for the having to go through so much, but there were some key points from chapters 38 and 39 I wanted to make sure we brought out before we got into the last part of this, where, even after all he's been through, Job prayed for his friends. Even though they weren't very nice to him, he still prayed for them and restored them to God. And they were able to come to the feast as well. So, I think we have several lessons here. We need to pray for our friends, even though they may not be the nicest people. We need to pray for them. And we just need to trust God and persevere. And that's what Job did.
Thank you for teaching Job. It's a lesson, it's many lessons, well examined and well studied and well learned, and I enjoyed it.
But there's so much information in the book of Job that you could spend weeks and weeks trying to mine out all these pieces. Throughout the book, there's keys in chapter 7, chapter 25, and some of these others that are just, you could spend weeks on just some of those chapters understanding, just how awesome God was, and how everything happened just at the right time, one piece at a time. And then at the end, Job finally, just says, okay, God, you're right. You're in control. I understand. You're wonderful. And then once he got to that point and realized exactly who God was and how sovereign God was, that's when things turned around. He had 10 more kids and saw, 4 generations kids, lived 140 years longer. So, you know, I don't have any idea how old Job was when he finally died, but we know he was at least 140. And at that particular time, that was pretty good, because that was, you know, after the flood and so forth. So living to be, you know, probably, you know, 140, maybe 170, almost 200 years. That's very good for that time frame. So, you know, I think it's interesting the lessons we learn. You know, they think about the constellations and the stars and all this and all this wonderful stuff. That's old stuff. We knew that 4,000 years ago. That's old stuff. People think this is the greatest thing. No, they done that 4,000 years ago. You're going to have to come up with something new. They didn't name them like we did today, but they knew about constellations and the star patterns and all of that stuff that God had made. And just realizing that all of that has been around for 4,000 years. Pretty amazing. Any questions or comments or any update on the prayer list that we have?
We have an update.
Yes.
We go, not this coming up week, but the next week, we go to the surgeon for a consultation. Then we go the next day to a radiologist for a consultation. Then we go back the next week to the oncologist to hear what he suggests is the best plan. He's saying now, because it's so small and just started growing, that hopefully they can just zap it with the radiation, but he wants the other doctor's opinions before he does anything. So that's where we are.
Okay. So it's a progressive.
It's squamous cell carcinoma. You usually get them on your face, but sometimes they'll get in your lungs, and this one.
I'm inside out.
Okay.
But anyway, it's small, but it has started growing since December. He had CT scan in December, then one in March when he was in the hospital, and so it has started growing and it needs to be treated.
Okay.
Basically like pinpoint radiation, since it's in a spot.
Yeah, that
Dennis. my
Two
brother-
options usually, it's radiation or surgery.
yeah.
Usually the only two options. I think it's caused by not fishing enough.
Now
You
you
go
sound
fishing more
like
often.
him. You sound like.
That's exactly what it is.
My brother Dennis that came with us the other day to eat at Buckner's had pinpoint radiation right here for one under his tongue and his throat. And he's been through all